Hi everyone. I've got something a little bit technical for you this morning. Just wanted to talk about watercolour washes, what they are, but more importantly, how to control them. A wash is very simply the application of wet watercolour to the paper. It can be a big area like a sky, or it can just be the side of a boat, something like that. When you're putting wet paint down on the paper, you're making a wash. If we had to be technical about this and break it down, there's three types of washes really. There's the flat wash, which is simply just covering an area with a flat colour. There would be a graded wash where again you're using one colour but perhaps it's darker at the top and much lighter at the bottom, or from side to side, or vice versa. An area that has a different intensity of the same colour, we call that a graded wash. And then finally, there's a variegated wash where within an area you're combining different colours and allowing those colours to run together. So they're your three main wash types. And there's essentially two ways of doing all three of those. You can paint them wet onto dry, that's self-explanatory, wet paint onto dry paper, or you can do them wet on wet, where you might be painting into an area of paper that you've wetted with water, or an area that you've painted, I don't know, in green and you want to drop a different colour, some blue into it, for example. That's what we call wet on wet. Now here's the thing. Your ability to control these washes, and in fact, your experience in knowing when not to control them, when to leave them alone and let them do what they want to do, they're fundamental to your ability to progress as a watercolour painter. Now look, I'm not a big fan of rules, and certainly within art and watercolour painting, the fewer rules there are, the better. It's not good to be constrained. We're doing something creative. We're doing something that's fun and enjoyable, right? So you don't want to have somebody telling you, well, you mustn't do this and you must do that, and there's a whole load of rules. But these two methods of making a wash, wet onto dry, wet onto wet, they do help to establish an important watercolour rule, and it's one of the few that you'll hear from me. And I'll say to you, this is something you really need to observe and get the hang of if you want to progress with your watercolours and if you want to get better at controlling washes. And it's this. You can paint wet onto wet. You can paint wet onto dry. Either of those, no problem. What you can't do is paint wet onto damp. Let me show you what I mean by that. I'm going to paint a really simple sky here, and I'm going to show you a problem that crops up remarkably frequently in workshops and lessons that I do. We'll start at the top. I've got plenty of blue, ultramarine mixed up here. I'm just going to keep this wash coming down the paper. Plenty of paint. It's a flat wash. It's painted wet onto dry, as you can see. No problems at all. Paint's running down here beautifully. We're getting a nice flat wash. I think as we come to the bottom of the sky here, we'll switch into a little bit of green for the hillside. Switch into some green. Quite happy for it to pick up that blue bead there and it all meld in together. That's quite nice. Keep coming down here with our hill, and it's going really well. We've got a nice flat sky on. The hill's established. Perfect. Oh no, hang on a minute. Yeah, there is a problem actually. I've really wanted to have a flat sky, and I've left this annoying little white chip there. I didn't notice that when I was doing it. Hey, no problem. It's a flat blue wash. I've still got plenty of flat blue colour in my palette. I'll just put some more blue in, no problem. There we are, just in there like that. No problem at all. Same colour, and I'm putting it into the same colour. Oh, hang on a minute. Can you see what's happening? You think there's no problem? There's a serious problem. I've now got chaos descending upon my piece of paper here as a result of putting wet paint into what was becoming a damp area of the painting. As this dries up, and it does it rapidly, it becomes difficult to work with. You can't put wet paint back into that area again. This area here that started to dry and is going damp just wants to suck up all that nice juicy paint that you put down, and what happens is you start to get these runbacks, these horrible unsightly shapes. Sometimes you can use them to create artistic effects within your painting, but it's pretty difficult to do and not advisable. And we're stuck now. We've got this nightmare happening in front of us, and that is why you can't put wet paint into damp paper. This happens. And so the key with understanding how to work and control your washes properly is knowing when to leave this thing alone, which is what we should have done. We should have just taken a step back and gone, hey, well, there's a white area in the paper. It looked far better than this, I can assure you. So just doing that little exercise, you'll have seen that problems exist when we drop wet paint into a damp area on the painting or an area of damp paper. And what I want to show you now is actually what's going on when that happens, why you get these strange runbacks and these shapes that we're always trying to avoid in our watercolour painting. Bear with me, it gets a little bit technical, but it's a great exercise as well, so have a go at it yourself, because I think you'll find you'll learn an awful lot doing it. Now you'll notice in this painting of Weymouth Harbour that in the background are some nice cottages on the harbour or the quayside there. Because this is a complicated painting and the trawlers, the fishing boats, have got an enormous amount of detail in them, what I wanted to do was ensure that the background remained distant. And one of the ways of doing that is to soften the edges between shapes and allow them to run together a little bit. The cottages are a classic example because you can see that there's a pale blue one, there's a sort of soft pink one, a sort of biscuit coloured one, and I've painted those next to each other, each one being wet as I've painted it, and allowed them to merge a little bit. That's quite a difficult thing to do, and it's a similar thing to painting wet on wet. In fact, if you find a video by the very, very successful and well-known watercolourist John Yardley, you will see him paint this way. He sort of moves around his piece of paper and he'll paint one object and then it's still wet and he'll paint an object next to it and you think, no, whoa, hang on, John, it's going to be a bit of a mess if you're not careful. And it never is, because he's a master of understanding, timing, how wet his paper is and when to approach it and when to put other colours next to wet colours or to put wet paint into wet paint. And years of experience mean that his paintings end up looking absolutely wonderful using that technique. And it's a good technique to use. This little exercise is very useful. What I've done is I've drawn out 4 sets of, well, let's imagine they're the front of 2 cottages. You'll have to excuse the fact I'm going from right to left because I'm left-handed. That's just how it is. But it's good to do because you'll see different combinations of paint, concentrations of paint and dryness of the areas that we're painting, and you'll understand why we can't paint wet into damp without understanding what we're doing, as we saw in the previous exercise, turned into utter chaos. And let's now have a look and find out exactly what it is that's going on. So first of all, I've got a wash here of a sort of pale blue. It's quite dilute, and I'm going to paint this cottage here in the blue. Plenty of paint, remember, even though we're not painting a sky, we're not painting a field. It's just the front of a cottage, but we still want bags of juicy paint running down the paper. There we are. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just wiping my brush out here on this cloth, and it's damp now. I'm going to run it along the bottom and take that bead out, just so it's more even when we paint next to it. And immediately I'm going to go into this pink colour, which is the same consistency. It's just as dilute as the blue. And I'm going to allow it to touch blue, and I move my brush quickly down. Where it's wetter, it's going to bleed a little bit more at the bottom. But you can see that those two colours, because they're the same consistency, or concentration I should say, and they're both being painted very wet at the same time next to each other, they hold their ground. The blue is where I put it, and the pink is where I put it. Now let's imagine we're moving further down the street here, and, well, next to the pink cottage, let's put the pink cottage in. Next to the pink cottage is a dirty old shed, or warehouse, or something like that. And to represent that, I've mixed up some sort of dirty brown paint, and it is a lot more concentrated than the pink. But I'm going to paint both, as I did here, while they're still very wet, and we'll see what happens. So let's go to my lucky brown colour for the shed. Look at that, isn't that dark? You see what's happening here? Because this area is far more concentrated than the pink, it wants to flow across the boundary. Concentrated paint is being grabbed by this dilute area on the right hand side. It sees all this pigment and thinks, yeah, I could have a little bit of that action. And you have an entirely different situation happening. It's not a complete disaster by any stretch of the imagination. You can still see that we've got a pink cottage there, and we've got this dark shed on the left hand side. But the boundaries become a lot more blurred, and you can see it feathering across here, particularly where my brush was left on the paper for a fraction longer than just moving it down quickly. It bleeds out more because this area here that's dilute is not only taking it from the paper, it's starting to suck it out of the hairs of the brush too. So that's an entirely different situation to here. And like I said, it's not a disaster, it's workable. If we were doing this in the distance, and by the time we put a few windows on there, yeah, for sure, we could probably live with that. But now I want to go on to our third set here, and I'm going to paint the same thing again, but I'm going to show you a way that I think allows us to control this boundary a little bit better. So here we are, pink cottage again. Incidentally, I'm using this old sable. I've had it about 20 years. And I've got this funny thing. It's a bit of a confession, really. I get a bit anxious if I have brushes in my collection that I haven't used for a while. I don't like that. I just feel like every brush needs its day in the sun. And this one hasn't had an outing for a while, so I thought, do you know what? We're going to use it for the cottage exercise. And it's a useful thing to do. It saves you getting unpleasant letters from the paintbrush union for neglecting your brushes and things like that. Very important. And it's good to give them a run out. And of course, the more you use these old brushes, these old sables, the softer they become, and they're wonderful to use. Anyway, that's our pink cottage done. Now, instead of going straight in with the mucky brown colour here, I'm just going to wait for this to tighten up, to start to dry a little, and to become an area that we would call damp. And that's all down to your experience. At the moment, I'm looking at this, and I can see there's a nice shine on that, and I know it's still very wet. You've got to keep an eye on this. Watch it, and you'll notice in a relatively quick period of time that it's going to dry up and become damp, and it's sort of, how should I say, it almost has a silky sheen to it. It doesn't have that bright gloss that a wet area of paint has. And so keep an eye on it, and you'll know, and you'll be able to judge through experience how wet or damp this particular area is, and whether or not you can do anything with it. So I'm just going to wait for that to dry up a little bit more before I approach it with the brown colour. Okay, now that's starting to lose its shine. I can still see it's got a little bit of a sheen to it, so it's probably about the right time to put this brown colour next to it. Again, I'm not 100% sure that it is. It's difficult sometimes with these overhead lights to judge it perfectly, and that gives you an indication of how tricky it can be sometimes to get this sort of thing right, this issue of timing. So let's go in with the dark colour. And I don't paint initially right up to the line here, because there's a lot of paint in this brush and I don't want it all being sucked out, but I'll go down that line quickly. And you can see it's held its shape a little bit better. There's still going to be some feathering across that border. That's natural. In fact, that's what we want. That's why these cottages that I've painted in the distance here are painted like this. It gives that soft boundary between the two. Of course, if you want crisp detail in the distance, it's not advisable. But if that's what you want, then you'd paint these all as wet on dry washes. You'd paint the pink one, you'd let it dry, then you'd paint the brown one next to it. The issue that you have there is then you've got to match up the two edges. Do you try and do it ever so carefully? Yes, you can do that, of course, but sometimes you'll overlap a bit and then you get a dark line down the middle, or you'll think, okay, I don't want to have that happening, so I'll hang back a little bit and you get a white line in between the two. That's fine too, but for the effect that I wanted to achieve, that was a useful way of painting. And it just goes to show you what's happening with regard to concentration of paint and the relative wetness or dampness of the areas that you're dealing with. Okay, now further along the street, we're back to pink and blue cottages again. And I'm going to paint the same thing here, dilute blue and a dilute pink. But watch what happens now if I do what I did here. Allowed the first cottage to dry up and become damp. Let's put the pink one on this side, just to make things a little bit different. So pink cottage. And actually, you'd be quite surprised. When you're down in Weymouth, they are quite nice and bright. These little cottages that sit along the edge of the quay in the old harbour area. It really is quite charming. It's a lovely place. There we are. That's our pink cottage in. Again, I'm just going to, with a damp brush here, take out that little bead along the bottom. And again, I'm going to let that dry up, and I'm watching it. At the moment it's very glossy, it's very wet, I can tell that. I watch it and wait for it to dry. I am literally watching paint dry. But such is the fun of watercolour, you have to do it. Otherwise you will end up with all manner of different problems that are out of your control. And we're trying to learn how to control the wash. So watch your paint dry. Okay, so that's starting to dry up quite nicely now. Sparkle's gone, there's just a little bit of sheen on it. And now I'm going to paint in a blue cottage next to it. Let's see what happens. It's certainly merging with it. And I'm going to have a soft edge at the moment, or that's what I think I'm going to get. But you watch. We'll have an interesting situation developing shortly. Well, it's developing already, I can see it. Now what's happening here is what happened when we did the first exercise with the sky. This damp area here is it's just not wet enough to work with unless you're putting something very dark next to it. But I'm putting something of the same concentration, and what happens is the dilute paint starts to flow across into this area that's drying, and you can see what's happening. It's pushing away the pigment that was there, and some of the pigment that's here is also leaching across, and eventually this will dry up and you'll be left with a hard deposit where the pigment has run as far as it can and it just ends up being dumped on the paper. And that's where you get these horrible shapes, cauliflowers as we call them. So it's very clear what's happened. Look, the pigment has been pushed back, it's run as far as it can go, and it just gets deposited here and creates these blooms, these hard edges, these cauliflowers that you don't want. That was not the look you were hoping to achieve. You were aiming for that, but because this was damp, not wet, that was wet, this is what happens. And so it's something to be aware of, it's something to avoid. Now interestingly, just have a look at this. You'll notice the effect is more pronounced at the top than it is at the bottom. And the reason for that is because my board is at an angle and the water flows down this way with gravity, and it means that the wash that I've put here will always be slightly wetter at the bottom than it is at the top. Sometimes you can use that to your advantage, particularly in skies where you might want to put a cloud into an evening sky and your paper's drying up, and you can get a stronger definition to the top of the cloud and a softer one underneath. That's quite difficult though. That requires some very precise judgment and understanding of the paint that you're putting in and the wetness of the paper that you're working on. So let's just recap a little bit here. The first two cottages, equal concentration, both areas were painted equally wet, and the colours have stayed largely where I put them. On the second pair of cottages, or the cottage in the shed, let's call it, the second one, the shed, was far more concentrated than the cottage that we put down first. And so the pigment flows from the high concentration to the low concentration. The third pair here, again the cottage and the shed, we tried to find a way of counteracting that problem. So it's still a dilute mix here and a concentrated mix here, but we've managed that to a certain extent by allowing this area here, the less concentrated area, to dry up a little bit before we painted this shed on the left hand side. And then finally, same concentration of paints, but the problem that we had here was that one of these areas, the pink, was left to dry. It was damp. So when we painted wet next to it, we have all manner of problems happening. So in doing that little exercise with the cottages, which is great fun to do have a go. Hopefully you've noticed that there are two things that we can use to control what is a reasonably uncontrollable process. The first is the wetness of the paper or the area into which you're painting. You can control that depending on when you choose to approach it. And the second is the concentration of the paint that you're applying to that particular area. Are you putting on too much wet paint with too much water and not enough pigment? Or indeed, is it too concentrated for the effect that you're trying to achieve? Now, both of these things together, we call that timing. So your ability to understand timing, to work with it and to control it will enable you to start to wrestle back some control from this medium when you're working wet into wet. I'm going to do a quick demo for you just of an area that crops up all the time in my paintings. Middle distance and distant hillsides where I don't want to have too strong a tonal range, and I don't want to have too many hard edges either. And I come across this all the time. And it's at points like that in the painting that the timing of your approach to that particular area is critical. You get it wrong and it's quite hard to rectify. But if you get it right, you can create some wonderfully soft effects with it. So let me show you that. I'll show you some of the pitfalls and show you how we get around it. So here's an area of distance and middle distance that I regularly encounter in my paintings. We've got a hill here, we've got a few suggestion of a few hedges, some trees, that type of thing. And imagine this in a much bigger painting, and this particular area, I want it to be relatively soft. I don't want it to be too prominent and too obvious. And so what I'm hoping to achieve here is that these trees, the hedges, and the shapes within the landscape are going to be soft-edged. And the way that I'll do that is to paint this whole area of the hills, the fields, and then work into that at different stages of wetness. So when it's very wet, I'll show you what happens, and then as it tightens up and becomes a bit damper, you'll see how that works too. So let's start off with some blue for the distance. As always with watercolour, loads of paint. Got to have this nice juicy area at the bottom of your wash. Keep it all nice and wet, and then as it's coming down here, I'm just going to warm it up a little bit with some yellow as we're getting progressively closer. Turn that blue into a green by adding some yellow ochre. So a bit more. There we are. Just drag the hair across them. Yeah. There we are. So that's our landscape. Now that's still really wet, but dealing with this issue of timing, again, let me show you how not to do this. So let's say I want some sunlit edges to these trees here, and I put together a nice sort of sunlit mix of green. Now this is still quite dilute, and this is still quite wet. And if I put it in now, yeah, it looks good at the moment, but it's not really holding its shape. Can you see that? It's running way outside of these boundaries, and give it another couple of minutes, you're not really going to notice any difference. So that's not good. If this had got a bit drier and I did that, then I would also potentially be flirting with the idea of having runbacks and cauliflowers happening there. So again, approach the paper at the right time. Now I can see at the top here that it's starting to dry quite nicely. So I'm going to use a darker mix of green. And this mix here really is quite dark, it's quite concentrated. But bear in mind, you see, that I'm going to paint this into a damp area, and it will dilute this even further. Now, a good way of doing this, because you may not judge it right, and the timing may be a little bit off. So start in a large area, and you can see what effect it's going to have. Get a small brush like a rigger, even though this is a relatively large area on the tree, and just drop it in there and see what's happening. Look how much that's just spread out, just from a tiny little dot on the paper. That tells you how wet this area is, and it's still probably a bit too wet for what I want to achieve. So I'm just going to wait a little bit longer, although I know that, again, because the board's on a slope here, that up here I might be able to get away with it. Now, we haven't talked about this too much so far, and in controlling your wash, the size of the brush that you use and the amount of paint in it is also critical when you're working wet into wet like this. So if let me show you, if I put, let's say there's a hedge here, if I have a lot of paint in my brush and leave it down there for too long, you see what's happened? It's just grabbed it, taken it out of the bristles of the brush, or the hairs of the brush I should say, and the paper's still quite damp here, and we've got a problem. So let's go up to the top now and have much less paint in the brush, and just drop a few little spots on, and that will be more than enough to suggest those little trees there. And I'm hardly touching the paper with this. Now, for this area of, or for this hedge, again, it's a quick mark. Same here. I'm not too worried about whether I'm hitting the pencil lines, because if I was doing this as a real painting, I wouldn't have those pencil lines in there. It's much easier just to know roughly where you're going, put them in a bit hit and miss. It gives a nice feeling to the painting. See, that really is starting to dry up, almost to the point that it's becoming a little bit too dry to work with. But that means that I can now start playing around again with these trees here, and what I need for that is a far more concentrated mix of yellow for the sunlit area. So I'll put a little bit of blue in there. Again, this is quite concentrated paint, but I know when I drop it in, it's going to start to grip and hold its position more than it did first time round. So that it's staying largely within the boundaries of those pencil marks. And we're going to have a little bit of shade on the other side of the tree. So I've got this blue mix here, and I'm letting it all run in together. Oh, got a spider decided to join us. How nice. I'm just going to put you down there. Welcome. I'm just dropping that shadow side in. Nice. And I can probably work these trees over on this side too. Now you see this is almost dried too much, but it's still just about okay. Here. Again, it's damp. And I'm just dropping these shapes in, and that's suggesting trees. Now, even though this is a relatively large area here, again, I don't need a large brush. It's going to take that paint straight out and distribute it. And I work it around that shape. I've got soft edges still running together. Again, let's have some shadow. What I'm doing is giving you a magnified version of a distant area within my painting. Sunlit edge. Can you see? It's gripping and it's not running out of control. I'm in control of this wash. And what I'm doing, I have had comments on this before, what I'm doing looks easy. And people say, yep, I can do that. That's easy. And the way you do it, it looks so simple. And you know what? It is. I'm not landing things on Mars or anything like that. What I'm doing is ultimately simple. But as with all things, it only is simple if you practice doing it. At the outset, when I started painting watercolour, this was not easy. I had no idea what was going on as paint ran around all over the paper. And so you practice, you do little doodles like this. And the great thing about these exercises is that you're not under any pressure to produce a finished painting. You're just playing around with the paint, seeing what happens. Now, I'm quite happy with this because I've got my area of blue coming into the yellow. I've got soft hedges and trees that aren't jumping too far forward. I mean, admittedly, that one's a bit too dark. But I've got sunlight and shadows on those trees. I can now go back to this really, really dark colour and just suggest a bit of form by dropping in some darker colours here. And I know the area that I'm working on is at the right level of wetness or dryness to keep working at it. And this is really key in watercolour. Understanding where the point is, where you just have to step back and leave it alone. And I think that's what I'm going to do now. And I'm going to watch the little spider here do a couple of circuits of the board. Well done. Now, the second tool that you've got to help you control your wet into wet wash is called blending. And it's a way that enables you to persuade and tease the paint into the areas that you want it to go. And you don't want to do too much of it. It's a technique where a light touch is important. You're going to need a soft, damp brush. And also, you can assist what you're doing by varying the angle of your board. I'll show you both of those things and how they have an impact on your ability to control your wash. Now what I'm going to do is wet this area of paper here and then paint into it, because I want this to stay as wet for as long as possible to demonstrate what's happening here. So let's wet this area. Let's imagine this is the sea, and then I'm going to go into here with my blue, let all that run together. You can paint this wet onto dry straight away, no problem doing that, other than the fact that you will find that this dries much quicker. And to use blending as a technique for controlling your wet into wet washes, you really need the wash to be quite wet. Otherwise you will just start lifting paint off the paper. Now this paper is Milford by St Cuthbert's Mill in Somerset in England. It's just wonderful paper. It's hard sized, which means that it's more resistant to the paint, and so the paint tends to sit on the surface for a lot longer. Just taking this bead away from the bottom here. And it just gives you a bit more time to work wet into wet than would normally be the case. Now what I'm going to do is put the board down flat once I've done that, because that'll allow all of this area to dry at roughly the same sort of time. And what I'm going to do is mix up some very, very concentrated greeny blue colour. I'm using yellow ochre and I'm using ultramarine here, which I can then drop into this wash to suggest the ripples or the undulations on the surface of the water. And I'm just going to use a rigger for that, and I'll show you why. If I used a large brush, there we go, it's too big. It's no good. So get the rigger. It doesn't hold as much paint, and it enables me to put those ripple marks in while this is still very wet. And you can see that they dilute rapidly because the paint that I'm putting them into is very wet here. But that's okay. I don't want these to be obvious shapes in the water. I want them to be undulations. And the rigger's the perfect tool for that. It's not going to deposit too much on the paper here. Now, I don't know if you can see this, but you'll notice it when you have a go at doing this, that the darker shapes are starting to, the edges are starting to feather quite a bit. And that's where blending comes in as a way of controlling what's going on. Let me show you what I mean. Let me get an old sable brush that hasn't got too strong a point. It should just be damp. You don't want it to be, I don't want this to be really dry. If it's really dry, that's what happens. And then of course, if it's really wet, that's what happens. Cauliflowers. So I want it to be damp, and just with the lightest of touches, I'm going to run this along the edge of these shapes. And it just allows that feathering to be integrated into the background wash, and these shapes take on a slightly smoother appearance. It's a really good one for clouds in the skies if you want to control the edge of a cloud. And that's what blending enables you to do. But I can only do that at this stage because this is still very wet. As this continues to dry, this will become unworkable because I will put the damp brush in and it will start to lift paint out. So again, I've got to keep an eye on the dampness of the paper. I've got to understand the drying times here. I've got to be aware of the concentration of the paint that I'm putting onto the paper. I have to be aware of how much paint I've got in the brush. I have to be aware of the size of the brush that I'm using for the job. All these considerations become second nature after a while. And it looks quite easy doing this. And it is. This is not particularly complicated. But it's very, very easy to get wrong. And the way that you make sure you don't get it wrong is you practice it. And don't wait until you're doing a masterpiece for somebody and have a go and see whether you can make it work then. Get some rough pieces of paper, have a go, play around. Back to the blending brush. You can see that feathering there it's quite nice now. I can just run the brush through there, smooth that out. And I'm encouraging the paint just to get back in its cage a little bit. Just stay where I put it, thank you very much, for running all over the paper. And that's what blending allows you to do. It's a great technique to have, and when you use it and understand how to use it in conjunction with timing, then you are going to have a decent amount of control over what you're doing. You will be able to control your wash. Well, I hope that wasn't too dry and technical. But I think it's important. In fact, it's fundamentally important in your ability to really get the hang of this tricky medium that has its own mind, that wants to do what it wants to do. And what I'm going to do, and you'll see this in the next few days, is release another video. And I'm going to do a painting. It's quite a simple landscape. And it will incorporate these techniques, and it'll just give you an opportunity to see them in the context of something real, and I hope you'll find that helpful too. In particular, hopefully I'll be able to show you that there's a balance to be struck here. You don't want to have torrents and rivulets of paint running all over your paper that are completely out of control. But by the same token, you have to allow watercolour to do what it wants to do. It's part of the fun of painting in watercolour, and you often achieve things, if you're not too rigid with it, that you don't expect. Some people call them happy accidents, and they're areas that you can get within your painting that, well, they're there just because that's what watercolour wanted to do. And you have to look at it as it's happening, and you have to respond to it and make decisions. Say to yourself sometimes, yeah, do you know what? I hadn't planned for that to be in my painting, but I don't mind because it looks great. So in the next video, hopefully you'll see a little bit of that, where I'll just let things go, and other areas where I will want to exert the amount of control that I need in order to achieve the painting that I want at the end. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.